So I chose to do my project on LGBT discrimination, and I did this because I think it really relates well to the topic of this class, civic engagement. We've learned in this class about the founding ideals of this country, and so we know that it was based on the Enlightenment and a secular worldview. And so I think this is really relevant to today's political atmosphere because we see the current administration's stance on LGBT issues, their trans military ban, and several different court appointments. And I think that the court appointments are actually really, really important to talk about, so I'll talk about that when I get further into the presentation. So I already talked about the background, but hate crimes are another thing. So we've actually seen an increase in hate crimes recently. And obviously I'm a nurse, so I'm going to talk about health. So poor health outcomes are actually a big thing for LGBT people. They're at an increased risk for multiple different poor health outcomes. I think that also relates to civic engagement and being able to be involved in public life, because if you're not able to obtain a certain level of health, I think it really affects your level of participation in your society. And so my official thesis statement is what barriers do LGBT people face to fully participating in public life. And so in my paper, I explored this, and I'm going to give you a brief summary of this presentation. So health disparities. LGBT youth are up to 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual identifying peers. And gay men are the most at risk to develop HIV or STDs, especially among Black gay men. And then lesbians are, this I thought was really interesting, lesbians are less likely to get preventative cancer services, and trans people are probably the most discriminated against. They really don't seek out healthcare, so they're at risk for basically every poor health outcome that you could have. Transgender people are most at risk for. And one statistic that I found from healthypeople.gov was that 41% of transgender people have contemplated suicide, and that's crazy, considering that nearly half of transgender people have thought about or attempted suicide, and that's a pretty conservative estimate that they give. And another thing is conversion therapy. So this is like a pseudoscience about trying to use behavioral modification to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, and it can have really horrible effects on mental health of individuals who are forced to go through that. It can cause PTSD and then also impair their ability to form new relationships after that. And then lack of access to care is another one. LGBT people are more at risk for homelessness, being lower socioeconomic status, and also just lacking the basic access to healthcare. And there's actually many places where discrimination in healthcare for LGBT people is still legal, so that's like a big barrier for them to maintaining a certain level of health. Violence is another thing that I focus on in my paper, and I have just a lot of statistics from the FBI hate crime page from 2017, and so there was a 17% increase in hate crimes from 2017 compared to 2016, and there was about 1,470 victims were targeted due to their sexual orientation or gender identity, which makes up 17% of all hate crime victims, which is pretty crazy considering that Gallup estimates anywhere between like 3 to 5% of the population identifies as LGBT, and they make up 17% of the victims of hate crime. So I think that statistic is staggering. And violence is a huge problem globally, and so the reason that I think violence relates to civic engagement too is because we control the laws that govern our country, and you can see in other places they don't respect human rights, and you can even be put to death for being gay, for being transgender. And so I think that it's really important that we advocate for humane and equitable society here in the United States. And so this is the biggest part of my paper and my project was the lack of legal protections, because this is civic engagement. This is how we can create our society, create the kind of world that we want to live in. And so there's no federal legislation protecting LGBT people from discrimination. And so this is really dangerous because there is no law saying that you can't target someone based on their sexual orientation or gender identity in our federal legislation. And so there is an act that's being proposed in the legislature right now, and it's called the Equality Act, and it would add gender identity and sexual orientation to protected classes under federal hate crime laws. And so if that gets passed, then it would be considered a federal crime to commit hate crimes and acts of violence against LGBT people. And so in states like Ohio, it is legal to discriminate in many different areas based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So that includes housing, employment, healthcare, and there's only one county in Ohio, and that's Cuyahoga County, that has a non-discrimination ordinance. And that ordinance is great, and I'm really happy they passed it, but it only bans businesses from discriminating against giving services to LGBT people, so you can still be discriminated against in housing, employment, and healthcare. So it's a great step, but it really doesn't fix the huge problem. So right now in Alliance, if your landlord found out that you were gay and they didn't want you to live in their house, they could legally remove you from the lease and kick you out of your house. And that would be legal in the state of Ohio today. And so there's also no constitutional protections for sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And the 14th Amendment has been used to defend equality in several different cases, including the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, but there's no explicit constitutional protections for equality even between men and women besides the right to vote. So the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protections Clause of that amendment, has been used to justify granting equal rights to women, but there are some people who, that's just up to their interpretation of it, because at the time that that amendment was passed, it was for Black American men to be considered full and equal to white men. And so it's been used to broaden the scope of that, but that's not what the intention of it was. And some constitutional scholars, like Anthony Scalia, he was the Supreme Court Justice who just passed away, he views the Constitution as you have to look at what it meant at the time that it was written. So he believed that that didn't actually grant women the equal rights because it was not the intention of it. So he wasn't against equal rights for women per se, but he said if you wanted that, you had to pass an amendment for it. So that's why it's important that we advocate for, and I'll get to this in my recommendations, but advocate for constitutional protections and amendments for explicitly for sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, because then you can't leave it up to judges to interpret that because it's explicit. And the ACLU reports 54 proposed anti-LGBT bills across state legislators, and that's just an estimate. There's probably some more in the works. And so this is just the rebuttal to what I have to say in my stance on LGBT rights, is that marriage and equality is not about equality and diversity. And this is from Alliance Defending Freedom, and they're a nonprofit organization who fights what they call traditional values, and they believe that the foundation to a healthy society is a home with a man and a woman running it, raising their children. And they think that if we change this definition and we change the way we think about how we relate to other people, that's going to lead to the decline in society. So they cite a lot of statistics about how well kids do when they're raised from two parents who are married, and then how well kids do in school when they're married. But all these statistics really are skewed because there's a lot of evidence that same-sex parents raise their children very well, and you can't really say that having LGBT people in a society would create a moral decline in it. I think that we all decide the morality that we have for ourselves, and so I just refute this. And so I think that American values and what my values are equality, freedom, and then also having compassion for other people, and I think that that's what we should be focusing on. And clearly our founders had an imperfect vision for the future, but they really believed in individual freedom and equality, and I think we're just expanding that. So I think that it only makes sense that we expand it to all people. And so my recommended action is that we pass the Equality Act in Congress, so vote for people who are going to support it, and lobby your legislators to pass that, and vote for candidates who are more pro-equality, and advocate for the non-discrimination ordinances in your city or county, like the one in Cuyahoga County, because if you act locally, think nationally, globally, then that's how things change. You have the most power to affect change within the communities that you're a part of, so that's the civic engagement part of this, is that you really need to own your power and own your responsibility and things like this. So if you don't think that LGBT people should be discriminated against, then you have to act upon that in whatever way you can. And I think people are most effective in doing that in the communities that they live in. And the people that they have the most influence over are their family, friends, and their coworkers, people that you interact with in everyday life. And then our current system is structured in a way that it shouldn't be. So we should be willing to change that. So people might think that changing the Constitution is too drastic of a step, that we don't need it. And even some women's rights advocates don't think that we need to pass the Equal Rights Amendment because they think that they're covered under the 14th Amendment. But in one way it's symbolic, because it says that in what we consider the highest law authority in our country, the Constitution of the United States, if we have explicit protections for people based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, that would mean that we really value that we think it's important, and that it's the law, that it is what we have decided to govern ourselves by. So that's why I think it's really important that we do that. I don't think it's too drastic, and I think that if we can amend the Constitution in a way that makes our society more just and equitable, that we should do so. And then I think we really should pass the Equal Rights Amendment, and that doesn't guarantee equality for sexual orientation or gender identity, but it does create explicit protection for women, and I think that we should finally affirm equality between men and women in our society. And one thing that I didn't mention when I was talking about legal action, but I talked about in my paper, is the idea of legal precedent. So when a court rules something like based on the 14th Amendment, then it affects other legislation. So if they say, oh, well, this protects women, then they create a legal case and it's a legal rationale for the next thing. And so it kind of built on itself. So it's harder to reverse precedent. So although the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protections Clause do protect women and could be applied to LGBT people, I think it is still important to set that explicit statement in the Constitution and in our federal laws, because it is still up to a judge's interpretation. If we had some crazy, like, psychotic Supreme Court, then they could overturn precedent. They have the authority to do that, but they don't have the authority to rewrite the Constitution of the United States. So my conclusion is that LGBT people face multiple barriers to participating in public life, and that we each have a responsibility to advocate for new changes under the law. And I hope that you guys would consider this. I think it's really important, and this is what civic engagement is all about, is defining your values and then fighting for those values to be recognized in society.